Welcome back to Venom News. I am Corby Winston, a former ecologist and a journalist in the Genetics and Ecology Scientific Journal. This week you are listening to The Buzz Beckons, Episode 10, CCD. In recent years, you may have heard the term colony collapse disorder, the horrific occurrence of tens of thousands of honeybees disappearing almost overnight within a colony and no dead bees found around the hive. This is a serious issue because bees are our main pollinators, contributing to 1/3 of our nation's food supply, worth nearly $15 billion annually. Today we will be exploring the response to the decline of honeybee colonies in terms of policies and regulations from the perspectives of a scientist, beekeeper, farmer, and our very own Secretary of Agriculture. I have spent the past several weeks interviewing these main players involved in the issue in order to compile an up-close and personal story of the disappearing bees. As you will hear, colony collapse disorder cannot be attributed to a single cause, which makes it a difficult catastrophe to combat because there is no single solution. However, certain causes are more attributable to our modern beekeeping and farming practices. As I mentioned, it is difficult to pin down the decline of bees to one single reason. We will hear from Dr. Smith, the director of a research lab in the University of Pennsylvania, to explain various contributing factors to CCD.
There are many causes to the decline of bees, including widespread use of pesticides, as well as parasites, pathogens, and climate change. The loss of biodiversity caused by the destruction of habitats and agricultural monocultures are particular threats to all pollinators. It is becoming more and more evident that some insecticides, such as neonicotinoid-based pesticides, which are applied at higher concentration in the heavy pesticide-based agricultural system, lead to the mortality and altered foraging abilities of feral and commercial bees.
These neonicotinoid pesticides have become the most widely used pesticides in the U.S. Studies have shown they have sublethal effects, such as disrupting the immune system of honeybees, as well as their cognitive abilities to navigate and communicate with the rest of the colony.
However, figuring out how specific pesticides affect the health of bees is complicated. Intense pesticide use also occurs where there is a lack of natural habitats for pollinators. In general, though, the pesticides compromise the bees' immune system, which makes them more susceptible to parasites and pathogens, such as the varroa mite and Israeli acute paralysis virus. The weakened bees are unable to effectively clean, sterilize, and build their nest, which causes further weakening of the colony. Lastly, on top of everything affecting the bee colonies individually, climate change has altered the natural environment where bees and other pollinators can be found. This means that environments where bees would normally be able to find food are no longer accessible during certain parts of the year, which also contributes to the declining bee populations because bees are unable to receive adequate nutrition.
As findings have shown, there are several areas that need to be addressed in order to combat CCD from both a biological standpoint of bee health and the societal practices of farming and beekeeping. There are farmers, and then there are bee farmers. What people tend to forget is the mysterious but absolutely necessary relationship between farmers and bee farmers that is the true key to keeping both of these parties in business. But before jumping into any particular story, we must emphasize the huge diversity of farms that exist, their different motivations, and their varying philosophies on farming or beekeeping methods. These farms all have their own opinions and practices on pesticide use to their involvement with policies. This is precisely what makes the bee issue so complex. Marissa has been farming for 23 years and runs a large commercial farm in Northern California, Capay Valley, and has experienced the loss of bee population with truly tangible consequences.
It was 2007 when the bee farmers were talking about something called CCD, colony collapse disorder. I could care less about the scientific name. The bees are dying, that's all we were hearing throughout the valley. I mean, we were already seeing it too in our crop yields. You see, we're farmlands hundreds of acres around, and I knew that our pollinators weren't doing so well. Frankly, because, well, our squash here and our tomato plants and our cherry trees, they all weren't doing so well.
It's no easy task recruiting bees out of nowhere. If the environment isn't so good for bees, how do large commercial farms cope?
You see, we're a farm, a large couple 100-acre farm at that, and it's no secret that we grow food to sell, and we sell to make a profit. We're just running a business like any other. The loss of our honeybee population has truly been bad for business. We've got to work with our beekeepers, or bee farmers, you can call some of them. I work with Byron, who comes all the way from Wyoming during the winter, and he starts bringing in the crew. More than 100,000 bees in crate hives. Bees in boxes. And we've only recently been working with Byron since I'd say around 2010 because the farm just simply isn't productive enough. And our production went up dramatically since we've been working together. And we've been inseparable ever since.
Large farms, especially ones like Marissa's, are monocultures. They're cherry trees on a 100-acre plot of land and tomatoes on another 100, with other plants and vegetation integrated within the plots. The farm might be diverse in that it is not just a one-crop focused farm, but these plots of crops are grown in rows for acres on end with its own species. There is no diversity in the farming vegetation, and this is called monoculture. You will see almond trees as one of the largest monoculture fields out there in California. Monoculture environment has not been conducive to the survival of bees, and ironically, this contributes to the low count in honeybee population and the same reason why these farms need to recruit bee farmers like Byron to pollinate their crops.
However, to tell the truth, I can't say like everything about what we have come to, using honeybees in shipments by the thousands. I see so many bees dead, and it's not like I enjoy that. Shipping them all over the place works them hard. Like I said, we need to make money selling our crops, but the relative success we get from using bee shipments, it doesn't change that the bees are still dying all around the world. The bee farmers are having a hard time. Maybe I'm getting by with the bee workers we hire for the season, but it's short term. I think we're all trying to work out on a sustainable solution. But in the meantime, like I said, we're trying to make a living. Some farms aren't as big. They're trying some other ways of dealing with the problem. It also comes back to different philosophies and what you're willing to give up. There are trade-offs. Some smaller scale farms are trying out an approach that is more focused on creating an environment for wild bees. It's all about diversity. It gives bees a chance to live off of pollen from flowers that bloom at different times of the year. These farmers are really optimistic of the approach, and they're willing to take some losses, hoping it pays off in the end, and they can rebuild their missing pollinator communities on the farm. Some of us, mostly the larger farms I guess, aren't willing to take that risk. Also, that's a crazy dramatic shift that have to occur on a farm, and we're hundreds of acres, like I said. It would be really difficult.
There aren't even types of farms that are different, but every farm has a different ecosystem, landscape, and climate that simply doesn't give us the option to bundle up the bee scene on each farm into a category. Next, we get a chance to talk to Beatrice, a beekeeper from the Los Angeles area who not only cares for hives to produce honey, but takes her bees to assist with crop pollination in California's Central Valley. I asked her to explain to me the differences between types of beekeepers.
In the commercial beekeeping world, beekeepers work to profit in many different ways. And since it's all about supporting yourself, most of us use our bees to make money in as many ways as possible. I primarily focus on making honey, so I like to take my bees to places where they have a lot of pollen to forage from. Many other beekeepers travel with their bee colonies to use them for crop pollination all across the nation. I recently started carting my bees around for pollination, and the almond season in California's Central Valley brought in a lot of money for us this past February.
As you can see, beekeepers must work endlessly to make sure that they are profiting from keeping their bees. Commercial beekeepers have hundreds or thousands of hives that they must take care of, and many families have been beekeeping for generations.
I've only been in the industry for 8 years, but since then I've learned so much from the people who've been working with bees their whole lives. Taking care of bees is difficult work, and it's been emotionally and very financially taxing to see so many die recently.
The beekeepers are seeing the decline in bee populations firsthand and have a real sense of what is changing.
Beekeepers around the country and the world have all voiced their concern over the amount of bees dying. We can't do our jobs if this keeps happening, and we all have a lot invested in the health of bees.
I also asked her why she thinks the bee populations are declining so rapidly recently.
Well, of course, everyone is trying to fight the varroa mites that are killing bees, and it would be nice if monoculture farming practices didn't prevent bees from surviving on farmlands. However, I think we can all agree that pesticides are the biggest factor in the death of our bees. To us, it's pretty obvious that pesticides are extremely harmful to bees when you take your bees to a farm that has recently been sprayed and a week later more than half of the population is dead. It terrifies me to think that these chemicals are killing bees so easily and are still being used. What are we going to do if this doesn't stop? We won't have any food left.
Of the reasons bees are dying, pesticides seem to be the one caused most directly by human actions, and seemingly the most simple to stop. But it's not that easy.
Ultimately, no beekeeping can be treatment-free, even if pesticide spraying of anything is prevented while the bees are present. A lot of spraying is done at night while bees aren't foraging. Farmers claim that they will be relatively gone in the morning, but there are still plenty of opportunities for the neonicotinoids in the pesticides to be ingested and brought back to hives via pollen.
This points out the difficulties beekeepers and farmers are having to find a balance in their businesses. Many beekeepers and farmers are trying to find new tactics to keep bees alive and thriving.
Yeah, some beekeepers and colleges around the country are breeding bees in attempts to make them more resistant to different chemicals. I'm not sure how successful this will be, but I do have hope for the breeds that could be more resistant to varroa mites. That would be nice to not have to deal with them anymore.
In the end, beekeepers seem to agree across the board that pesticide use must drastically decline in order to save the bee populations, and that it's not as simple as that. That's just one of the pieces that policymakers must take into account as they write legislation that will hopefully keep bee populations alive in the U.S. We have heard the scientific perspective from Dr. Smith about the causes of colony collapse disorder, as well as its influence on the livelihoods of farmers and beekeepers. But what has actually been done to counter its effects? This is where the government steps in. Tom Vislak has served as the Secretary of Agriculture since 2009. As the co-chair of the Pollinator Health Task Force and the head of the United States Department of Agriculture, Vislak is highly involved in the policies made to promote and protect various pollinators, most notably the honeybee.
President Obama created this task force in 2015, and since then we have released a national strategy aimed to reduce winter honeybee losses by half and improve 7 million acres of land for pollinators. I have worked ambitiously to establish necessary funds to be distributed by the USDA, collaborated with numerous organizations to design projects, and have also overseen projects to promote awareness of the pollinator decline. Fortunately, the President's 2016 fiscal budget has increased funding for the USDA to $82 million, specifically to be used to address the devastating decline in honeybee populations. The USDA has $56 million for research and associated statistical survey programs, and is putting money towards land-grant institutions to support local and regional pollinator issues.
Increased funding and awareness in recent years has allowed for the commencement of numerous projects designed to rejuvenate the honeybees and their pollinating grounds.
Some projects underway include the Environmental Quality Incentives Program to provide monetary compensation to farmers who follow pollinator-friendly practices, and the Conservation Reserve Program, which aims to enhance food security for pollinators to improve their overall health. These programs were implemented under the 2014 Farm Bill and administered by the USDA Farm Service Agency. Funds to plant flowering plants within farming areas have been provided to a targeted area that includes North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, where over 65% of the managed honeybee population resides in the U.S. The idea is that providing a greater variety of food sources will improve the nutrition received by pollinators during their use in large-scale monoculture agriculture. An additional goal of the Conservation Reserve Program is to expand foraging lands.
Marissa's farm, as you heard, is one such monocultured area that would benefit from the Conservation Reserve Program because it could receive new varieties of nectar-producing flowers as well as the reintroduction of native plants. However, California is not in the targeted areas to receive funding. Nevertheless, recent efforts have the potential to have an impact across the U.S. as a whole, and research and program implementation are projected to expand.
We hope to see results by 2020. However, the U.S. Department of the Interior has $1.5 million in new funding to support our research priorities. This includes developing studies, monitoring programs, pollinator habitat models, and aiding in decisions for land and resource allocation. And we're not yet finished developing programs. The EPA has $500,000 to further expand the state pollinator protection plans.
As Vislak mentioned, the EPA has been involved in efforts to protect bees, but this agency is also surrounded by controversy. Research has shown that the pesticides are associated with the decline in pollinator health, yet chemical companies argue that they are safe and they continue to be distributed.
Chemical companies themselves are responsible for conducting safety tests on their products, which are then reviewed by the EPA. The EPA has ordered additional field testing to be done in order to study the long-term effects of pesticides, specifically systemic neonicotinoids, on honeybee health. However, chemical companies have been slow to respond. In the case of the neonicotinoid sulfoxaflor, the Pollinator Stewardship Council argued that the EPA did not enforce appropriate follow-up tests required for the Pollinator Risk Assessment Framework outlined in the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. The court ruled in favor of the Pollinator Stewardship Council in 2015, thereby removing EPA approval of sulfoxaflor, prohibiting its use in the U.S. This process of removing potentially hazardous pesticides from the market is handled much differently in Europe, where they follow precautionary principles. Even when a pesticide required additional testing after initial EPA approval, it can remain in use. Whereas in Europe, pesticides are banned if there is any doubt of their safety. The U.S. has responded more slowly to the bee crisis than in Europe, where more policies and programs have been put into place, but the U.S. has come a long way in recent years. Also, in terms of funding, the EPA has $1.5 million put towards studying acute toxicity among bee populations and identifying risk management options.
So, the EPA has been making progress in terms of banning pesticides that could potentially have long-term impacts on bee health, but perhaps not as efficiently as environmental regulatory agencies in Europe. The situation varies even more greatly when you take in a full global perspective.
China and Australia serve as two extremes in regard to honeybee health. In China, some areas have become so chemically polluted that honeybees are no longer able to survive there. People have resorted to selling pollen in packets to be administered by hand. This hand pollination is not as successful as natural pollination, resulting in smaller yields of agricultural produce. Conversely, Australia is the last place left where honeybees can thrive on their own. Australia happens to be the only continent free of the varroa mite, which is responsible for the spread of detrimental pathogens in bee colonies. Here, beekeepers are working to proliferate the success of these honeybees and preserve genetic diversity.
Despite the differences in how CCD is being handled across continents, it is clear that the dramatic decline in bee colonies is a global crisis, and everyone must be involved in order to change the detrimental environmental impacts that humans have contributed to. Regulatory policies are required to enforce the changes necessary to promote and improve bee health, specifically in terms of limiting or banning potentially harmful pesticides. While the complete removal of pesticides may be unachievable from a business standpoint, adopting more natural farming and beekeeping practices by enhancing the monoculture farms with native plants and a variety of nectar-producing plants would help provide pollinator-friendly environments. Ultimately, this requires funding, which can be promoted through spreading awareness of the decline in honeybee populations and how very different our world would be without their many contributions. So ask yourself, what kind of world do you wish for the future? A world of color and luscious vegetation where humans are considerate of their environmental impacts? Or a world where we put ourselves first to get what we want without considering the long-term effects? It's up to us. Thank you for listening to The Buzz Beckons. Join us next time for episode 11, Zika virus. Who knew insects could be just as destructive as they are vulnerable?